Hi, in my interview this week on writing ELT materials, I talked to Dr. Amina Douidi, who is a specialist in an intercultural approach to materials writing, materials design. Initially, I get her to tell us a little bit about her background. It's fascinating, and then she goes on to what is the theory of an intercultural approach and how does it impact on materials design. We look at some examples of images and discuss how you source images to use in your materials. And we also look at complexity of text. It's a fascinating area. The interview probably lasts slightly longer than normal, but it was just, we covered so many different areas that I found personally really interesting. And I tried to get at some sort of tips on how we can apply an intercultural approach to our own materials. But it is complex, it's challenging, it's not as simple as just take away some tips. So you have to stay with us, but I think you'll find it really interesting.
So hello, my name is Dr. Amina Douidi. I am an ELT professional. I currently act as a diversity, equity, inclusion consultant with publishers. My background is in English language teaching and modern languages. I hold a PhD where I worked on, from the University of Southampton, where I worked on intercultural communication in secondary school course books and the promotion of interculturality in secondary schools. Basically, how can we promote this wonderful concept that everyone is praising um, practically in the classroom, and what's the reality of the teachers working with already published materials?
Before you became a doctor, what was your kind of teaching experience and background?
So I have experience teaching French in Algeria to international students, mainly sub-Saharan African students who travel to the north of Africa to get an education in mainly science subjects. And a few years ago, and now it's changing in Algeria, um, the science subjects are/were taught in French. So I was teaching French as a language of instruction to English speaking sub-Saharan African students. And from that experience, I just knew that my purpose in the industry in English language teaching would be intercultural and would be about bridging the gap between the different communities. In that case, it was between the host community that was French speaking, Arabic speaking, majority Muslim, and the international students who were coming from a Christian background, but also were of Black and minority ethnic in Algeria.
And am I right in remembering that you did your PhD research in the materials from that context? Is that right?
Yes, I was provided with textbooks from France to teach French in
Mm-hmm.
Algeria to Tanzanian students who needed to get a baguette somewhere in some town in the middle of France. So that's where my um, objective started, basically. How can I make these materials relevant? And I
So,
started
so just
working.
describe to me what, when, if we can, I can sort of picture what these materials look like. But I mean, what was the sort of the gap between what you were seeing on the page and what the students, who the students were?
Okay, so you would have, in terms of images first, you would have white people in going to a boulangerie to get croissant,
Mm-hmm.
and there would be a discussion between the boulangère and the customer on the price and the quantity and the kind of wherever the experience that you would get when you go to buy a croissant in a boulangerie in the middle of somewhere in France. But the reality of my students was different. They needed to get their scholarship sorted with um, administrative staff that was Algerian, mainly Arabic speaking, but also spoke French, but French that was Algerian, not from France. And they needed to get ready to go to university and sort out their paperwork. And they also needed to access books and library resources that were in French that they then can access in English as well. But the first step would be French anyway.
So there's a
So all
number of
those
sort of
books.
confusing issues here, isn't there? There's you selected, or materials were selected for you that didn't really represent your target learner, which many teachers and writers will be familiar with. And presumably there was nothing printed or published available that would have suited that context, no?
It was just the assumption from the decision makers that they needed to learn the alphabet and they needed to learn grammar and they
Right.
needed to learn how to structure a sentence. There are materials on how to, they're called French for academic purposes, they're called French for administrative purposes, they exist. However, the assumption from the leadership team was these are the books we have, work with them.
Yeah. Okay. I think a lot of people will be familiar with that situation in different ways. And this, being forced to use a certain book that doesn't necessarily reflect the background or interests of your learners, and also probably represents a certain agenda. I mean, looking at pictures of people going to buy croissants in boulangeries is not necessarily, if you don't have much money or whatever, then it's a bit like picking up course books that say, the unit on holiday is always some exotic holiday somewhere, which most people go on holiday kind of somewhere in their own country to the coast or whatever, and it's not necessarily reflective of the learners in that way. Anyway, so that background led you into your academic studies. Did you want to move us on to, so when you talk about applying an intercultural approach to materials, what's the basic theory behind it?
So from that experience, I knew I wanted to work on course books, and I knew that the cultural representation was problematic, but also I knew that my background was language education. When I enter the classroom, there should be language input anyway. So the assumption that they would be learning grammar needed to stay there. However, the relevance of it needed to be questioned. So I went on to do masters in Spain, and when I did that, the masters in Spain, my experience learning Spanish was very informative in an international setting, and this concept of interculturality just became part of my life. And then pursuing the PhD, because I am trained in ELT, not in French teaching or Spanish teaching. So moving on to the PhD, my idea was how can I deconstruct the materials I have and learn from what are the struggles of the teacher? Is interculturality a priority for them? Or was it just me thinking that the world should be this flowery, let's live together and love each other
Well, I
kind
think
of
that's a good
way.
approach to life, but okay, yeah. Anyway, I think many people would argue really with you. So, so if we think, okay, let's approach this from the material writer's perspective. I'd like to start with the image. So you've shared with me, for example, 4 example photos, and if I'm a materials writer, often I'm starting writing materials and I'm choosing images. Why have you chosen these 4 images? What do they kind of represent for you in terms of materials writing?
Linking back to what I just earlier, they represent our everyday reality. These are the kind of people I meet when I go outside, and these are the images that make my reality, which is diverse. So when I open the textbook or when I am writing materials, I want to give permission to my student to bring their reality to the classroom, but also give them a space where they can see their own reality. And in my classroom, there are children. who come from single parent families. There are children who have different religious backgrounds. There are children whose skin color is not the majority skin color in that classroom. And there are other children that they are majoritized or considered the majority in that space. So there is a lot of research and studies that show that representation matters, but it's not representation when it comes to materials writing. It's not representation of, or let me add a person of color in my textbook to check the box of diversity, but rather let me represent the reality that my students are or will be experiencing.
Does that, in terms of your, if you're like your line of argument, would you suggest that's therefore a global course book is almost not possible in a way, or not appropriate?
If we think about global course books as being these, they are broken down. The world is not represented in terms of a homogeneous entity, but rather in a global course books, you would have units, and each unit would talk about a topic, and that topic would reflect certain reality, whether geographical or a reality of a profession or some kind of reality anyway. And within that reality, if you notice, we are scaling down from the big word, which is globe, to let me check about how can this reality be reflected to the character I am representing, whose narrative I am going to say to tell. So if it is geographical, then I'm gonna make sure that my intercultural approach is not homogeneous and not talk about the geography as monolithic. If I'm going to represent England, I'm not going to represent the royal family. But I'd rather represent the reality of somebody who is in the middle of the street and looks around and sees the diversity they're dealing with. I am more likely as a student to learn a language where I will be interacting with someone in London of Indian background rather than someone who is white, middle class, of English background. And that's the perspective that diversity and equity bring into place.
What's your opinion then on, if you look at sort of mainstream publishing now, do you think it's getting better?
It is. It is. It's not there yet. That's why I have a job.
That's right.
That's why I'm still, I have a livelihood. I can.
But I mean, as somebody who's been involved in materials writing for a long time, I would like to think we're doing better. I don't think you do see stuff about the royal family in course books as much anymore, and those kinds of, the tropes of the sort of the red telephone box and all of that kind of thing. And even
there's nothing wrong with it, to be honest.
No, and I think there's a demand, and students do like it, and it does exist.
Yeah.
We can't pretend it's not there, but I think it's less presented as a standard. And certainly in because I used to do a lot of intercultural training in the context of business English, I was always very struck by the approach that you present culture in terms of, you present perhaps one personal story, you read about someone else, and then you turn it around on the student, say, well, how is it for you? So even if it's, basic sort of levels, the way somebody's working day in a certain context, you turn it around and say, well, how does that reflect in your local context or your culture, kind of thing? And as long as the material's doing that works. But you've got to have interesting context to make that happen. And if you represent the daily life of the royal family, that has no connection with most of us. So it's very hard for us to turn it around on the student and say, how is life for you? Where if it represents a sort of a more normal sort of setting, it's much easier to do that. I do think one of the challenges as a materials writer is sourcing the right kinds of images. I just want to go back to the images you showed us, and on the next slide we've got the sources you've taken from. Can you just, you don't have to tell us specifically about those images, but when you're trying to source good images for an intercultural approach in materials, where do you go?
First, I need to have my principles clear. Why do I need that image? And once I answer that question, then it would be easier for me to access and know where to find these images. So if I take you into the logic of building a material and the path I go through, then the image I go through. So sometimes I start with the image and sometimes I start with the concept.
Yeah.
Most of the time, teachers have a learning objective that is language focused. So they would have to write a unit where there is first where they need to use I don't know, a grammar rule, past perfect or present perfect, and then from that linguistic learning outcome, they build the linguistic the instructions, etc., and the activities, and they play around a little bit with the variety of activities. They might need a text or they might need an image to support that activity. Depends which approach you're taking. Is it inductive or deductive? So my principles are informed by the intercultural communication research. So my goal is, how can I combine between language learning plus the relevance of the content culturally and in terms of reality representation, as I said. Then it would come to the usefulness and the effectiveness of that learning outcome to the learner. So then if we're going to talk about, let's say the topic would be, let's say my unit is about family. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to, and I already have the language in check. I already know which learning outcome I'm going to reach. Then the topic will be family. When it comes to family, I have three principles I follow. The first one is the diversity of representation, i.e., how can I represent a family that is not overly already represented out there? That means heterosexual couple, mother, father, boy, girl, grandmother, grandfather, grandmother, grandfather. So how can I represent a reality that one of my students, at least one of my student experiences? So I go and look for single parents, for example, or same-sex parents, or big families that are not necessarily very represented in the global north, for instance. But if I am in the global south, where there is a majority big families, I might want to represent that as well, because I want to equip my students with the language to talk about their own reality. I want them to be able to say, no, he's my friend, but I consider him a cousin because we grew up together and we lived in the same house, and etc., etc. So the language that my students will need is informed by their reality, and the representation I'm going to choose is informed by that as well. So I'm going to go for single parents, and then I'm going to look for charities depending on the context. If I am working in India, then I could represent a minority group in India, and I want to represent their reality authentically. Or I could represent a majoritized representation of a single parent family or a family in India. But then the narrative and the text I'm going to write about needs to be complex, not simplistic, stereotypical, etc. So that's the second principle. The first one is the diversity, and the second is complexity.
We can come back, we can move on to the complexity of text, which we will in a minute, but just at a very practical level, when you this might seem like a basic question, but it's a real question. As a materials writer, I might want to find a context in a certain setting. So, but in terms of photo stock sources of images, if I go to some of the really well-known ones online, which everybody knows the name of, so I'm not going to bother saying, they don't give you that kind of range necessarily. If you type in family, you will get 2 parents, 2 kids. You won't get mixed, diversity. You won't get a real family. And that's not an excuse, because actually you can find images of family, and ideally, if you're choosing a sort of a real example, we all know families are complex, and it's rare that you get the standard sort of format. So you actually, that if you go looking for the real source, you find it. But just in terms of finding legal copyright images, what kind of sites can you go to for that kind of content?
So if you're working with the publisher, they would have their own bank of images
I
anyway.
know, but my experience tells me that they're often not very good.
Yeah.
They're getting better in the same way, but they have the same struggle that I would do as an independent materials writer.
Then if your description is as detailed and principles as I just gave you, then it would be their responsibility to go for that if you're working with a publisher. But if you're working for your classroom,
Yeah,
and I personally would advise looking for authentic materials either on social media, but always citing,
right.
since it is not for the purpose of making money.
Okay.
So as long as you will not be selling those materials and making a profit off the image of other people, my academic background says to always cite your sources.
So here are some concrete examples from the images that you've
Yes.
shared. Just what's the background on where you've accessed these?
So the first image is of Asma Al-Badawi. She shared it on LinkedIn with with the text that we maybe will get a chance to talk about. I was using this image for webinar purposes, and I was going to use her as I know her name and I know her as a person. She's real. She's not posing for the picture. And so I messaged her directly and I said, can I have your permission to use this image for a webinar purposes? I explained the idea behind my task and she agreed. The second image, I knew I wanted representation of single parents. So I went and didn't look for the image. I looked for articles where there is the discussion around single parents. And fatherhood is also a topic that is very interesting for a lot of people. And fatherhood among the Black community, within the Black community in the United States, for example, is a big topic and it's very critical. So I went and looked for the topic and it was accompanied by a picture. And my job was just to use it, understand the background of it, and cite it. The other image is from social media, and I am an Instagram user. And these two children that you can see are of Arab and Japanese background, and their content is in Arabic. And my idea was I wanted to show that ethnicity doesn't mean automatically nationality and doesn't mean automatically language. So if you look a certain way, doesn't mean you speak a certain way. So that was my message. Thus, I used that authentic image and cited it again. And again, these materials are not for selling purposes. And you mentioned, I mentioned earlier charities. So charities, there are a lot of people working towards inclusive materials. So if you look for, and if you Google banks of images that are inclusive or inclusive images, and then you decide which group you want to include, age is an important theme. So then you would look for representation of elderly that is authentic and that is not representation of older people always as frail and fragile and baking with the grandchildren, etc. So it,
Yeah.
add an inclusive keyword to your search.
It's
And you
interesting, isn't it? Because particularly course books, I guess, because they've been so targeted to the young, it's interesting representations of much older people, and you're right, people over the age of 60 have always had a pretty bad deal when it comes to sort of their appearance in educational materials. They're either baking cakes or
or
grandfather.
heroes.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting thing. But I think a key point to pick up on, you go searching for the topic you're interested in, you find it. And then actually, I mean, and this is my experience, and I'm doing it more and more, where I've just found actually if you email somebody and said, I love that image, are you prepared to let me reuse it, and so on? In most cases, people are. And sometimes they'll let you use it for free. If it's for publishing purposes, there's some sort of fee involved, but then there should be. And it's quite surprising that if you want the sort of the personal story type topic in your materials and there's an image, more often than not, people are quite happy for you to reuse that image in some way. So it's true, you don't have to start with the stock sites. Though there are some available, and I'll put in some of the links with this video afterwards of where you can go and find those types of images, because there are some interesting stock sites now emerging for use. I'm really interested in this idea of complexity of text that you talk about. Now, we've gone back to an image you showed at the beginning, and you talked about the image. Tell us about this idea then of complexity of text connected with this image as an example.
Okay, so I see this image in a textbook, and it usually accompanied with instructions. So the first instruction, something for speaking for the first 5 minutes of the lesson, and the instruction would be, what does this image inspire you? What do you think this person is thinking? And you have, these questions that you can encourage your student to reflect on, so you can have a task or an activity on that. Then my idea of complexity is not really new, because people from different backgrounds have been calling for challenging stereotypes, and teachers are very familiar with the concept of stereotypes, and materials writers want to move away from them. But how can they do them? So my proposal is to think beyond what the image shows. That when I ask my teachers or whoever is watching this image, saying, what do you think the narrative associated to this image is, most of the responses were about inspirational Muslim woman who can do whatever she wants, including playing basketball, which is true.
I just think nowadays you just stick it in the unit called sport, probably.
You could, and then you can check the box of, yeah, I have a person that is not historically represented in a sports unit.
Yeah, that's right.
But then if you want to move beyond the tokenistic,
yeah,
checking the box thing.
Okay, let's move beyond it. So what's the text? What's the story behind it then?
So Asma here is an activist. She is a poet, and she's also an athlete, and she is dyslexic. And on her LinkedIn post, she posted this picture with a text about her diagnosis, how it got.
Is this the text?
Yes, it was. This is part of the text where she says that she got good grades and um, okay grades, but then she got diagnosed very, very late. It is not in the screen here. She carries on and talks about how she got diagnosed only when she was at university. So yeah, that's her reality, and her reality is beyond the veil she's wearing, and is beyond the ball you see in the picture. And the narrative and the story that she is sharing is complex. And it doesn't fit into a box. And when we want to represent dyslexic people, because again, disability and neurodiversity is very rarely represented in course books, which image would you choose?
Thanks very much to Amina for her time. It's such a complex area, but really fulfilling to try to apply it to your own materials. It's not straightforward, it's not simple, it's complex, but that's good. I put a link below this video to a webinar that Amina did with the British Council, where there's more time given to the theoretical background of an intercultural approach. So take a look at the link there. And don't forget that we're running a course. Kath Bilsborough and myself will be running a course in writing ELT materials Go to writingeltmaterials.com for details of the course starting in February. And obviously, a lot of what Amina's talked about in this video will inevitably come up in that course. So hope to see you there too.